The year was 1864. America was in the middle of the Civil War. The country was divided between the Union in the north and the Confederacy in the south. Thousands of soldiers had been captured and sent to prisoner-of-war camps. In Richmond, the Confederate capital, one of the most feared places for captured Union officers was Libby Prison. The building had once been a tobacco warehouse. Now it had become a prison. Inside were Union officers who had been captured during the war. Conditions were extremely difficult. The prison was crowded. Food was poor. Disease was a constant danger. The prisoners dealt with cold, hunger, lice, and vermin. The basement was especially terrible. The prisoners gave it a nickname, Rat Hell. But beneath that miserable basement was something the Confederate guards did not fully understand. There was a way out. And a small group of prisoners had begun thinking about it. The plan. The escape did not begin with a dramatic attack. There were no guns, no explosions, no army storming the prison. Instead, the prisoners chose something much slower. They would dig. A group of Union officers began working on a tunnel from the prison basement. Their tools were simple and improvised. Historical records describe men using items such as old iron pieces and chisels to break through the structure. Every inch of progress had to be made carefully. The men could not simply dig whenever they wanted. They had to worry about guards. They had to worry about noise. And they had to hide the evidence of their work. The tunnel slowly moved beneath the prison. 4 days the prisoners worked. Then more progress was made. Eventually they broke through a wall. And suddenly the impossible began to look possible. The tunnel had reached beyond the prison. The men had found their escape route. But there was still one enormous problem. Getting out of Libby Prison was only the beginning. They were trapped deep inside Confederate territory. Outside the walls waited the streets of Richmond. And beyond Richmond were Confederate soldiers, checkpoints, rivers, farms, forests, and thousands of miles of dangerous territory. If they were caught, they could be returned to prison. Some might never get another chance. But on the night of February 9, 1864, the plan was finally put into action. One prisoner entered the tunnel. Then another. Then another. Soon the escape was underway. And by the time the guards realized what had happened, 109 Union officers were gone. But the most dangerous part of the escape had just begun. Because now, 109 fugitives had to survive outside the prison walls. The tunnel had been completed. Now there was no turning back. On the night of February 9, 1864, Union officers inside Libby Prison began making their way toward the opening. They knew the escape had to be quiet. Every sound mattered. Every minute mattered. If the Confederate guards discovered the tunnel too early, the entire plan could collapse. One by one the prisoners entered. They crawled through the narrow passage beneath the prison, moving through darkness toward freedom. The tunnel was not comfortable. It was cramped, dirty, and dangerous. But compared with remaining inside Libby Prison, it was worth the risk. And then something extraordinary happened. The first men emerged outside the prison. They were free. At least for the moment. More followed. Then more. The escape continued through the night. By the time it was over, 109 Union officers had made their way out of Libby Prison. It was an astonishing number. But the Confederate guards did not immediately understand what had happened. That delay gave the escapees something they desperately needed. Time. The morning discovery. As daylight approached, the escaped prisoners began moving through Richmond. Some tried to stay together. Others separated. Their goal was to reach Union forces. But Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy. They were surrounded by people who supported the Confederate government. And the escapees were wearing prison clothing or whatever clothing they had managed to obtain. They could not simply walk through the city announcing who they were. Every person they passed could potentially identify them. Every soldier could stop them. Every road could lead them toward capture. Meanwhile, inside Libby Prison, the guards finally discovered the problem. The prisoners were missing. A search began. The tunnel revealed how the escape had happened. But by then many of the men were already gone. The Confederate authorities now had a major problem on their hands. More than 100 Union officers had escaped from a prison located in the heart of the Confederate capital. And those men were heading into enemy territory. Into the unknown. For the escaped officers, the next stage was not about digging. It was about survival. Some prisoners tried to travel north toward Union lines. They had to cross territory controlled by the Confederacy. They faced the possibility of patrols, hostile civilians, hunger, exhaustion, and the simple difficulty of knowing which direction was safe. The safest route was not always the fastest route. And traveling during the day could expose them. The escaped men had to make choices that could determine whether they reached freedom or returned to captivity. But they were not all moving together. That mattered. A large group would be easier to notice. Smaller groups had a better chance of slipping through. Some escapees were eventually helped by people sympathetic to the Union cause. Others traveled through difficult terrain. And some were captured. The escape had been spectacular. But it was not complete. Freedom was still uncertain. The Confederacy responds. The news of the escape quickly became a serious concern for Confederate authorities. Imagine the situation. A major prison stood inside Richmond. It was supposed to hold captured Union officers securely. Yet more than 100 had walked out through a tunnel. The escape embarrassed the Confederate prison system and created a dangerous security problem. Searches were organized. Authorities looked for the missing officers. The roads leading away from Richmond became dangerous places for the fugitives. Every hour that passed could bring the search closer. But the escapees had one advantage. They had started moving before the guards fully understood what had happened. The tunnel had bought them a head start. Now they needed to turn that head start into distance. And somewhere ahead was the one thing they wanted more than anything. Union territory. The journey north. The escapees did not have a simple road to freedom. They were surrounded by a country at war. Railroads were controlled. Roads were watched. Military units were everywhere. The men had to depend on their knowledge, luck, and sometimes the help of strangers. Some were able to make their way back to Union lines. Others were not so fortunate. For the men who escaped, every mile mattered. The farther they traveled from Richmond, the harder it would be for Confederate authorities to find them. But there was another danger. The war was still raging. Union and Confederate forces were fighting across the region. The escapees could not simply assume that every soldier they encountered was friendly. They had to be careful. They had escaped from one of the Confederacy's most notorious prisons. Now they had to survive the battlefield surrounding them. And while some men were moving toward freedom, others were being pulled back toward captivity. The Libby Prison escape had succeeded on a scale that shocked both sides. But the final number would not be as simple as 109 men escaped. Because the real story was about what happened to each man afterward. Some reached safety. Some were captured. And some disappeared into the chaos of the Civil War. The escape had begun inside a dark basement. Now its prisoners were scattered across Virginia, each fighting his own battle for survival. And the Confederate authorities were hunting for them. The tunnel had given them freedom. But freedom came with a price. The tunnel had done its job. But now the real danger began. More than 100 Union officers had escaped from Libby Prison, and they were scattered across Confederate territory. Some were traveling alone. Some moved in small groups. Some had help. Others had almost nothing. They had no safe road, no guarantee of food, and no way to know who they could trust. The Confederate authorities wanted them back. The search begins. Inside Richmond, officials understood that the escape was more serious than a simple prison break. These were not ordinary prisoners. They were Union officers. Many had military experience. Their return to Union lines could strengthen the enemy, while their escape had already exposed a major failure in Confederate security. Search parties began looking for them. The men who had escaped now had to stay ahead of the search. But the geography of Virginia gave them both problems and opportunities. They needed to move north. The Union Army controlled territory farther north and east, but Confederate forces controlled much of the area between them. For the fugitives, the safest path was not always obvious. They had to use whatever information they could find. And sometimes they depended on ordinary civilians. Help from strangers. One of the most remarkable parts of the escape was the assistance some fugitives received from people living in Confederate territory. The Underground Railroad had been used for years to help enslaved people escape to freedom. During the Civil War, networks of Union supporters and anti-Confederate civilians also helped some escaped prisoners. For the men from Libby Prison, such help could mean the difference between life and death. A meal, a place to hide, directions, a change of clothing, even a warning that Confederate soldiers were nearby. These small acts could keep an escaped prisoner moving. But helping a Union officer was dangerous. Anyone caught assisting an escaped prisoner could face serious consequences. So the fugitives could not simply knock on every door. They had to find people they could trust. And trust was difficult in a country torn apart by war. Not everyone made it. The escape had been spectacular. But it was not a clean victory. Some of the 109 men were captured before reaching Union lines. The Confederate search did not stop simply because the prisoners had left Richmond. Patrols and local authorities continued looking for them. Some fugitives were forced to hide. Others kept moving. And some became exhausted by the journey. The men had already survived captivity. Now they had to survive the escape itself. This is an important part of the story. A prison escape can look simple when viewed from a distance. A tunnel is dug. A prisoner climbs out. Freedom. But in reality, the tunnel was only the doorway. The dangerous journey came afterward. The men who kept moving. For those who continued north, the goal was clear. Reach the Union lines. Once there, they would no longer be hunted as escaped prisoners. They would be soldiers among their own side. But getting there could take days. The escapees traveled through countryside where Confederate soldiers could be nearby. They had to avoid major roads when necessary. They had to deal with the cold. They needed food. And they needed information. Some men traveled mostly at night. Others moved when they believed the route was safe. There was no single journey. There were more than 100 individual stories unfolding at the same time. Each man faced different dangers. Each made different choices. And each had a different chance of getting home. A race against time. The farther the prisoners traveled, the more important time became. If they could reach Union territory, their chances of safety would rise dramatically. But if Confederate forces found them first, the men could be returned to captivity. And there was another problem. The Civil War had turned the landscape into a dangerous maze. Military units could move quickly. Front lines could change. Roads that appeared safe could suddenly become dangerous. For the fugitives, knowing where the armies were was almost as important as knowing where they were going. Every decision carried risk. Go left and they might meet soldiers. Go right and they might lose valuable time. Stay in one place and someone might discover them. Keep moving and exhaustion could become their enemy. The escapees had won their first battle inside Libby Prison. Now they were fighting a different kind of battle. A battle of distance, silence, and endurance. The escape becomes a symbol. News of the escape spread. The fact that more than 100 Union officers had escaped from a Confederate prison became a powerful story. For the Union, it was a remarkable example of courage and planning. For the Confederacy, it was an embarrassing security failure. But history would remember something even more important. The escape showed that prisoners who seemed completely trapped could still find a way out. The men had been surrounded by guards. They had been locked inside a prison. They had been deep inside enemy territory. And yet they had built their own way to freedom. But the story was not finished. The escaped officers were still scattered. Some had already been caught. Others were getting closer to Union territory. And somewhere ahead, beyond the Confederate lines, waited the moment they had been fighting toward. Home. But before that happened, some of the escapees would face one final and terrifying obstacle. They would have to cross through territory where the difference between freedom and capture could be only a few steps. And the question remained. How many of the 109 men would actually make it back to the Union? The escape had begun with 109 men. But now their paths were separating. Some were hiding. Some were still running. Some had been captured. And others were getting closer to the Union lines. The Confederate search was still active. The escaped officers knew that getting caught could mean being sent straight back to prison. But slowly, one group after another began moving farther away from Richmond. And then came the number that would define the escape. 59. According to the National Park Service, 59 of the 109 escapees eventually made it back to Union lines. 48 were later captured, while 2 drowned in the James River. That meant more than half of the men who entered the tunnel eventually reached safety. But their journey was anything but easy. The man who started it. At the center of the escape was Colonel Thomas E. Rose of the 77th Pennsylvania. Rose had been captured during the Battle of Chickamauga and brought to Libby Prison. From the beginning he wanted out. He helped organize the digging operation in the prison's basement, an area prisoners called rat hell because of the large number of rats. The work took weeks. The prisoners dug at night. They used makeshift tools. They worked beneath the floor of the prison and eventually created a passage that reached a vacant lot near the prison. The plan worked. But Rose's story did not end when he escaped. He was eventually captured. And even after being recaptured, Rose tried once more to escape from Confederate custody. That attempt failed. He was returned to Libby Prison and remained there until he was exchanged in April 1864. His story showed just how dangerous the escape had become. Leaving the prison was one thing. Staying free was another. The men who made it. For the 59 officers who reached Union lines, the journey ended with something they had not experienced in months. Safety. They had crossed through enemy territory and survived. Some had traveled with others. Some had relied on people willing to help them. And some had simply kept moving until they finally reached friendly forces. Imagine what that moment meant. After months of captivity, After crawling through a dark tunnel? After hiding from Confederate patrols? After walking through dangerous countryside? They were finally among Union soldiers. They were no longer fugitives. They were free men. But there was no single heroic ending. Each escapee had his own journey. Some disappeared into the chaos of the war. Some returned to their military units. And some had to recover from the physical and emotional strain of captivity and escape. The men who were caught. Then there were the others. 48 escapees were captured, according to the National Park Service. For them, the freedom they had tasted did not last. They were found and taken back into Confederate custody. Among those captured was Thomas Rose. For these men, the prison walls returned. The tunnel that had promised freedom had only given them a temporary chance. But even their recapture could not erase what they had accomplished. The Confederate prison system had been breached. And more than 100 Union officers had walked out. 2 men lost to the river. 2 of the escapees never reached the Union lines. They drowned in the James River. The river was part of the landscape around Richmond, and its currents made escape dangerous. 4 men trying to cross Confederate territory, natural obstacles could be just as deadly as soldiers. The 2 deaths added a tragic ending to an otherwise remarkable escape. Out of 109 men who escaped Libby Prison, 59 reached Union lines. 48 were recaptured. 2 drowned. Every number represented a person. Every person had entered that tunnel hoping to survive. A failure that became a legend. For the Confederacy, the escape was a serious embarrassment. Libby Prison was located in Richmond, the Confederate capital. It was not some isolated camp in the middle of nowhere. It was a major prison holding Union officers. And yet the prisoners had spent weeks digging beneath it without the escape being stopped. The National Park Service describes the February 9th escape as the largest and most sensational escape of the Civil War. The story became famous because of its scale. But the most remarkable part was how simple the final breakthrough was. The prisoners did not destroy the prison. They did not overpower every guard. They did not fight their way through the front entrance. They created a hole. Then they disappeared. The tunnel was now behind them. The prison was behind them. But the Civil War was still raging. And the men who escaped had become part of a story much larger than one prison. Their escape showed the power of patience, planning, and determination. But there was still one final question. What happened to Libby Prison after the escape? And how did this infamous building eventually disappear from Richmond itself? The answer would come years later. Because the prison that once held hundreds of Union officers would eventually be dismantled. Brick by brick. The tunnel was gone. The prisoners were gone. And the escape had become history. But the story of Libby Prison did not end when the 109 Union officers escaped. In many ways, that was only the beginning of the prison's final chapter. What happened to Libby Prison? Libby Prison remained in Richmond during the Civil War. But as the war moved toward its final months, the Confederate position became weaker. In April 1865, Union forces entered Richmond. The Confederate government abandoned the city. And Libby Prison was no longer needed as a Confederate prison. The building's history, however, was far from over. After the war, the prison became a symbol of the Civil War itself. People wanted to see the place where thousands of Union prisoners had been held. But there was a problem. Richmond was changing. The old prison building was no longer useful for its original purpose. Eventually, Libby Prison was taken apart. Its pieces were transported away from Richmond. The building was reconstructed in Chicago, where it became a Civil War museum. Visitors could walk through the same structure that had once held prisoners. But the famous escape remained one of the most powerful stories connected to the building. The tunnel that changed everything. Think about what the prisoners had accomplished. They were locked inside a prison. They had very few tools. They were surrounded by Confederate guards. They had no modern equipment. No power tools. No cameras. No technology to help them. And yet they created a passage underneath the prison. It was not a perfect plan. It was not safe. And it did not guarantee freedom. But it gave them a chance. That chance was enough. On February 9, 1864, 109 Union officers escaped from Libby Prison. Of those men, 59 reached Union lines. 48 were recaptured. And 2 drowned in the James River. Those numbers tell the complete story of what happened after the tunnel opened. The man who refused to give up. One name stands out from the escape. Colonel Thomas E. Rose. Rose helped lead the effort to dig the tunnel. He escaped. He was captured. And even after being recaptured, he continued trying to escape. His story represents the determination that existed among many prisoners during the Civil War. For soldiers held behind enemy lines, escape was not simply about leaving a building. It was about getting back to their own army, back to their families, back to their country. And for some, it was about refusing to accept that captivity was the end. Why this escape matters. The Libby prison escape is sometimes described as the largest prison escape in American history. More precisely, it was the largest and most sensational escape of the American Civil War, according to the National Park Service. That distinction matters. The United States has seen many enormous prison escapes throughout its history. But Libby stands apart because of the number of prisoners who escaped at once and because of the incredible circumstances surrounding it. More than 100 military officers escaped from a prison in the Confederate capital during one of the most violent wars in American history. And they did it through a tunnel they built themselves. The final image. Imagine Richmond in the early hours of February 9, 1864. The city was still. Inside Libby Prison, guards believed they were holding their prisoners securely. But beneath their feet was an empty tunnel. One by one, Union officers had crawled through the darkness. They had stepped into the night. Some would reach freedom. Some would be captured. 2 would lose their lives. But none of them could know how the story would end when they entered that tunnel. That is what makes the escape so remarkable. The prisoners did not know whether the tunnel would collapse. They did not know whether guards would discover them. They did not know whether they would survive the journey. They simply knew one thing. They had to try. And on that February night they did. The legacy. Today, the story of Libby Prison survives as one of the most extraordinary escape stories of the Civil War. It is a story about planning, patience, courage, risk, and survival. The prison walls were supposed to keep the men inside. Instead, the prisoners found a weakness beneath them. They turned a dark basement into a doorway. And through that doorway, 109 men stepped into one of the most dangerous journeys of their lives. The tunnel may have been small, but its impact was enormous. Because sometimes the greatest prison escape does not begin with breaking down a door. Sometimes it begins by digging beneath it.